For the sake of your eternal salvation, to all your listeners, it is time to turn your AR-15s into plowshares.
Or you could donate them to Armed Lutheran Radio. That would be fine. I'll take the chance. I'm willing to risk it on your behalf.
Faith, firearms, and freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and all that good stuff. But most importantly, God's Word and what God's Word says about gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. This is episode number 321. Thank you all so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week. And we are joined again by the pistol packing padre himself, Pastor John Bennett. Pastor, welcome back.
It is good to be back. It seems like it's been forever since the last time we chatted.
It does. It just, everything kind of with work and your schedule and mine have been kind of wacky, so...
And the world is just as crappy as it was the last time we talked. It
really is. It really is. And speaking of crappy, last week, as we discussed in previous episodes, we discussed red flag laws, extreme violence protection orders, as they're sometimes called. I talked about this a little bit last week, said that I'm not opposed to the idea in principle, but we've said in the past we don't like red flag laws in terms of the practice, how they're put into effect, the devil being in the details. And this week, Sleepy Joe Biden had his big signing ceremony for the new gun control law, at which he was heckled by one of his own guests. I thought that was entertaining.
That was awesome.
You invite a guy to your grand ceremony to pat yourself on the back, and he gets up and shouts you down.
Yes. I mean, if only he would have had that. Now, that signing ceremony took place last week, right?
That was a couple of days ago.
Okay. That's what I thought, because I remember seeing something about it on the news.
I think the passage of the bill was last week, and they just did the big to-do with everybody maybe day before, maybe a couple or 3 days ago.
That's right. He did sign it before they had the big, public ceremony deal. Kind of ironic, though, because didn't seem to help out at all in Highland Park.
Not at all. And, even if there had been that red flag law in place, had there been a red flag law, and that's one of the things I discussed last week was, red flag laws are great, I guess, in principle, but if you don't actually, if someone doesn't act on them, what good are they? And this kid that shot up the parade in Highland Park, Illinois, was just a walking red flag. Yes.
I mean, you take a look at just pictures of this sick person, and it sure looks like, everything normal going on upstairs to me.
No, not exactly.
Yeah.
Speaking of Sleepy Joe, did you see Snoop Dogg came out with a new brand of cannabis in Joe's honor?
Yes. And by the way, edibles and that sort of thing are now legal in Minnesota. So don't tell the guy that I drive school bus for, but I just might have to give those a try.
They showed I saw somewhere a picture of like the bag with the art on the bag, and it's that famous picture of Joe Biden looking just completely lost. And it says in small print underneath, or big, it's pretty big print right next to his face, it says, "You won't even know what country you're in." Oh my goodness.
Yeah, when you're getting dunked on by Snoop Dogg, who, if you remember, protested outside the White House when Donald Trump was in office.
Right.
You know you got problems.
Things are not going well in Bidenville. And what we thought we would do here today, since this new law that Sleepy Joe signed offers federal funding for states that develop red flag laws, I thought, why don't we try to craft one ourselves and see if we can cash in? So that's what we'll be looking at today. But first, I want to give a shout out to the men and women who make this show possible each and every week, the members of the Reformation Gun Club. Today's special shout out goes out to Mitch from Stockbridge, Michigan, Anthony from Cottonwood Heights, Utah, Marianne from Watertown, New York, Kurt from Rialto, California, Jim from, I still have him listed as Jim from Fort Wayne. Jim Martin is our seminarian who is accepted or been assigned to a vicarage in Wisconsin, and I need to find out where that is so I can
good for him.
His call, his shout out.
And it just seems like yesterday that he was going to the seminary, so time sure flies.
It does. Gordon Lewis, Derek from Huntsville, Alabama, Drew from Excelsior Springs, Missouri, and Rich from Lawton, Michigan. Thank you all so much. And to all of the members of the Reformation Gun Club, thank you for your support, especially in these 9% inflation times that we live in. Thank you, Joe Biden. If you folks would like to find out more about the Reformation Gun Club, all the benefits that are available for members, including early access to the show, hundreds of hours of exclusive content, and invitations to our monthly online hangouts, the next one of which is coming up July 23rd. We'll have a big giveaway that evening as well. If you would like to find out about all of that stuff and all the membership tiers and all of that, check it out at armedlutheran.us/gun club and come and join us. We would love to have you there. All right. The new gun control law that was passed by Congress recently and signed in this crazy, embarrassing White House lawn ceremony this week provides federal funding for states to develop red flag laws. And these laws, for those of you who don't know, these are laws that allow police to confiscate firearms from people who have been determined to be threats to themselves or others. And what we've said on the show many times, including in my commentary last week, was that in principle, we support the idea because it focuses on the dangerous individual instead of, on gun owners at large, like with gun bans and all those kinds of things. The problem is in the way that the laws are generally crafted. And like I said, the devil is always in the details. To work, the law has to protect due process, and it has to be narrowly tailored to prevent abuse. And since politicians are really crappy when it comes to creating laws in general, and gun laws in particular, we thought we'd see if we could come up with something workable and see if we can get some of that Biden red flag money for ourselves. How about that?
That would be awesome. I mean, that would be like the ultimate sponsorship for the podcast.
Brought to you by the new...
Well, I don't know what would be better, brought to you by, Sleepy Joe Weed or Sleepy Joe himself.
That would be great. All right, so let's get to this. There are a bunch of questions, of course, that have to be answered up front to make these things work. And the first few have to be done. You have to do them absolutely right in order to prevent abuse. And you'll see what we mean by abuse in a second. If you're not familiar with these things, you don't really understand what I mean. So the first question obviously has got to be, well, who can request one of these things? Who can request one of these gun violence restraining orders? How do we limit it in a way that it prevents abuse? We just don't want anybody and everybody to, oh, my neighbor's got a Trump sign in his yard, I'm going to call in a...
Right. Yeah, because the way that it's crafted, somebody could, if there was somebody who I knew was a gun owner and I just didn't like the person, I could call up and say, hey, so-and-so threatened me with a gun this afternoon. And
Right.
that could result in them losing their constitutional rights. Not that I would do such a thing, but in principle, that's the way that the majority of these laws that have been passed work in reality. So
Yeah, you got to be really careful about who has standing to make one of these claims. Obviously, I would think like immediate, family living in the home, a spouse or siblings or children. That makes sense because they're the people closest to the individual who might be a threat. Do we limit? What about unmarried couples? What about roommates?
Right. Yeah, and there was a something in there that I guess there was a proposed amendment when they were going through the discussion in the Senate that there is within this bill ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend type of language, so that let's say you went through a bad breakup and you haven't dated the person for 10 years and they still hate your guts. That girlfriend could call up and say, well, my ex-boyfriend, he's a pretty violent person and he owns guns. You might want to look into that. So, it used to be back in the day that it was, you had a bad breakup and you had the quote unquote revenge porn where, your ex would leak nudes of you on the internet. And now it's,
leak pictures of your gun collection.
Yes. Revenge gun confiscation. So what could go wrong?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it needs to be people living in the same home with the individual. They can't just be. They have to have the same address, so you have to be living in the home together. I think if you're talking ex-wives, ex-girlfriends, ex-boyfriends, there is a way you could tailor that, though. You could there could be a trigger of a time frame so that you broke up with your ex 2 weeks ago because you just decided to do it today. That's probably
right. That they're violent and hey, this just happened and I'm traumatized by it. And by the way, they own guns.
Right.
Even then, I don't know how comfortable I am with that.
That's tough too, because how do you prove how long ago it was that you broke up with them?
Right. How do you prove that the motivation there is legitimate and not just, steeped in anger and revenge?
I think in the case of someone not currently living in the home, and that can be proven by, posted mail and bills and that kind of stuff. But if it's someone like an ex and they're not living in the home currently, I think you probably have to have a filing of an assault charge.
Right. I was going to say a police report of some sort.
Yeah.
And something more than just a restraining order.
Yes.
I know of a person who has a restraining order on them from their ex just because their ex hates their guts.
Right.
So it's got to be a little bit more than that. Yeah, there needs to be some sort of police interaction. Immediate member of the household, police interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we've been called to this house 3 times for domestic violence. Perhaps we should report this as a red flag incident.
Like the kid who shot up the Highland Park parade.
Yes.
Where you had police called to the home on multiple occasions and nothing was done except at the one case, I think they took away the knives in the house.
Right. Well, and that's the part that just boggled my mind. So, and of course, I know the laws vary from state to state. In the state of Minnesota, if you threaten to kill somebody, that is a misdemeanor offense referred to as terroristic threats.
Right.
Why was the threats? He had threatened to kill his mother, I think was the threat. And I could understand if the mother doesn't want to press charges because it's her son.
Yeah.
But why wasn't something done? And we'll talk through this. I when we get closer to the end, I'll give you the ideal law that I have been thinking about since all this started, going back to the Uvalde shooting, and based on everything else that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years with mass shootings.
Yeah. What about adult children or parents not living with the subject of the complaint?
I think immediate family member could just be the broad, and you can extend that to member of the household, but immediate family member, member of the household, law enforcement.
Yep.
I think if you limit it to those three categories, I think that's about as close as you could come to being able to have a law like this, while still in some obtuse way honoring due process.
Yeah. And if you combine it with a police report of a crime being committed, like you say, communicating threats or actually physically harming someone,
right,
then I think you've got a stronger case.
Right.
That way you can more clearly or more easily eliminate the he said, she said stuff and the potential revenge motive from the request. So that gets to, and I think we've answered some of this, was under what circumstances can one of these things be requested? Is it just because somebody said something mean? Does it have to be a suicide attempt or an assault, or how do we limit that area of consideration? What things do we exclude, I guess? Or how do we narrow that?
I think you would exclude just automatically verbal arguments, with the exception of threats of bodily harm to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those conversations where it'd be great to have Sergeant Bill in on this. I wonder how many police calls he gets just because people are arguing over something stupid and there's no threat of bodily harm involved.
Yep.
So I think you eliminate that. I think you restrict it to a history of violence. So that we'll take, for example, the shooter in the Uvalde school shooting.
Mm-hmm.
The guy had pictures of him holding up mutilated cats that he had killed.
Right.
Automatic red flag.
Yeah. So it's a combination of he said things, plus we have this proof of his mental state, perhaps. So it's
right.
So a combination of not just he said X, but he also has this past history that you can look at.
Right. And that's one of the things that is universally true with just about every single mass shooter event, that the shooter had a history of verbal threats of violence,
mm-hmm.
as well as one other contributing factor. So, we'll take the Highland Park shooting. That this was an aspiring rapper who had made a video of him doing a mass shooting event. Right. That, coupled with the threats of violence towards family members, should be automatically a red flag.
Right. That music video, quote unquote, was bad enough, but by itself, one could argue artistic license.
Right.
Combined with previous interactions with police, threats of violence or suicide, then yeah, that then becomes evidence of a mental state, perhaps.
Right. Or perhaps we have two incidents of one incident is artistic license, 2 incidents is showing a pattern of behavior.
Right.
So, if every other piece of quote unquote art that he creates involves him engaging in acts of mass violence, maybe that's an indicator that he's the kind of guy who would do something like that. If they're fantasizing about killing multiple people, fantasy is the last step before something becomes reality. A person doesn't just suddenly snap one day and do these things. Yes, there are incidents where somebody snaps. One of the great movies of the late 80s, early 90s, Falling Down.
Right.
Great movie. The guy just snaps after everything bad happens to him.
Mm-hmm.
But there is often a pattern of behavior, either physical behavior or communication of some sort, that indicates that this person is a threat to others. We look at the Parkland shooting. That the shooter in that case reported on himself, and they didn't do a damn thing about it.
Yeah. So it has to be, in order for this to prevent abuse, we have to make sure that it's not just a he said, she said. It has to be the report of a commission of a crime with evidence to such a crime being committed, like, look, my face is bruised up, or I have video of the assault, or whatever. It can't just be, well, somebody saying, well, this person did X. It has to be, you have to provide some sort of proof.
Correct.
And supporting documentation of some sort, whether it's video, whether it's audio recording, whether it's a written letter, or what, that kind of. It can't just be, oh, hey, this person did this thing, and I think you need to take their guns away. And it can't be anonymous. The person who's making the request cannot do this stuff anonymously.
Right. Well, and this is one of the things that I think was most egregious about that bill, is that in the bill, it states explicitly that there will be no public funding for a defense for the person who is accused of these red flag laws.
Yeah.
That's a big issue. And that's why I think that at some point, at least portions of this will be struck down in the Supreme Court. But there needs to be a requirement that if you report this person under a red flag law, that you are required to give testimony in court.
Yes.
And that's one of the other elements that needs to be involved with any of these red flag laws. That it isn't, well, you got reported, so now we're going to confiscate all your firearms. It's, you got reported, here is the date of your court appearance. It needs to be within a span of no less than 10 business days. And we're going to provide you with a public defender if you cannot provide one for yourself.
Yeah. Well, and that gets into the next point, which was, how does this process work? It has to be who's making these determinations whether or not to, once a report is made, who makes the decisions about whether to move forward with further investigation or further action?
Right.
And it has to be a court of law.
It has to be. I mean, we already have a problem in this country with activist judges. A perfect example here in Minnesota, there was some district court judge that just struck down several pro-life Minnesota laws, and this person has a history of being an activist for abortion. We already have a problem with activist judges in this country. That's bad enough. So there needs to be a set standard of due process. And that, again, is one of the reasons why I think that ultimately this law will be struck down in part or in full within the Supreme Court, because it violates two of our constitutional rights, the right to due process and the prohibition of the government of illegal search and seizure.
Right.
If there is a seizure of property without due process, that is a violation. So, I mean, and then, of course, the Second Amendment violation on top of that.
Well, and I spoke last week's show about the idea that for a criminal justice, for a justice system, for a legal system to be effective, it has to be swift and certain, right? The Constitution guarantees a right to a swift trial by jury. We can't have this thing just carrying itself, it has to move quickly. So we all know that our court system is generally bogged down with all the rise in crime we've seen across the country. So we have to make this work. I think we have to have special courts specific for this particular kind of case. I think you have to have a court that hears nothing but these cases.
I would also add another element to all of this, that the legal system, and if you're going to, in essence, violate somebody's rights because of, somebody reports them, there needs to be tax funds, public funds provided to allow the individual who is being accused under these red flag laws to receive a psychological evaluation from the psychologist of their choice. I would be very much against a quote unquote court appointed psychologist, because you know what the court system is going to do? They're just going to pick some anti-gun psychologist that's going to determine these things the way they want them determined.
Now let's get into that part of it now, because that's the next step. So you were talking about within, a hearing within 10 days. Let's say person X decides that she needs to file one of these restraining orders. It hits the court. The court looks at the evidence and says, okay, there's enough here for us to proceed. What do you think? What should be, in your mind, what should be the next step after that? Once, I think the initial step is they take the request, they look at the evidence, and they make a decision as to whether or not to look into it further or to dismiss it outright, right? So it's one or the other. All right, yes, there's enough here. So now what happens? Do you send an officer of the court with a summons to appear in this special court? Do you, because I'm not sure how it works now, whether they take into account the information and then they immediately go and take your guns. I think that's the way it works in some places.
Right. Yes. In some places, it is an immediate violation of your Second Amendment rights. And that's one of the biggest, glaring faults with this idea outright, is the fact that if somebody is so dangerous that they should be prohibited from having any firearms, and any firearms that they are in possession of are immediately seized, why is this person permitted to be free in the first place?
Right.
If somebody is such a threat, and the risk of violence by this person is so serious that they have to be denied their Second Amendment rights, that why then are they allowed to be free? And that's really at the heart of the issue, is that these red flag laws treat law-abiding citizens as criminals without evidence.
Right. I
that
think
you are guilty until proven innocent in these
Right.
cases.
Well, I think it needs to be treated similar to the way you would treat an involuntary commitment for a mental, because that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about someone who is potentially mentally unstable, potentially not mentally stable enough to own. I mean, you're making the assertion that this person is too unstable to be in possession of firearms. So it doesn't make sense to serve them and tell them you got to show up in court, because if they are unstable, now you've angered them and given them time to actually carry out some terrible act, because it might, if this is a person like the Highland Park guy who planned out all this attack on this parade, maybe receiving a summons pushes him to push his timeline up and do something before the summons happens. So I think you've got to treat this like, if the court decides to move forward, then I think you have to treat this like an involuntary commitment and
that's a fair
detain
point.
the person.
Right. That's a fair point. Well, and I would say either detain the person, or you could have the equivalent of a temporary restraining order. You'd have to create a new legal category for this, where their firearms are temporarily seized until a hearing is adjudicated and that there is a resolution to that hearing.
That's the part that kind of worries me a little bit, and that's the part that I talked about last week, was if they're potentially too dangerous to have guns, and we've got to take their guns while we make that determination, I think we need to detain them.
Yeah,
Then determine whether we confiscate the firearms, and whether or not that detention requires, maybe the law says, maybe we say, you're going to be detained for no more than X number of hours or X number of days. You're going to get a hearing and an evaluation with a therapist and a judge and your legal counsel present to determine what to do next. And next might be, we refer you to a mental institution for further evaluation and treatment. And we take your firearms. We confiscate the firearms, not keeping them, but just taking them away from your property. I think we have to treat that like involuntary commitment, because that's what you and I have talked about so many times, and what you just mentioned. You take the guns away from them, but you leave them waiting and angry because now they've had their guns taken away.
That's a very good point. And just like somebody who is, reported as being suicidal, they put you under a 72-hour hold to evaluate you. And maybe that needs to be a part of the process. You take into account the number of acts of mass violence and murder that have taken place where firearms were not involved. And we just had one a year ago in Waukesha, where a vehicle was used, and it's not the first time a vehicle was used in an incident of mass murder. And so perhaps if a person is considered so dangerous that they shouldn't be in possession of a firearm, and that's the point I was making earlier, that perhaps they're too dangerous to be permitted to walk freely until they are determined to not be a threat to other people. Yep,
I agree. I think you got to get them off the street. You got to give. I like the 72-hour detention idea. We hold you for 72 hours, not in jail, unless, of course, you're being accused of a crime.
Sure. And there needs to be an accusation of a crime. There needs to be a criminal charge filed. You can't just simply be held within a criminal situation without there being charges filed.
Right.
And again, that's my biggest issue with all of these red flag laws, is that they treat an individual like a criminal without them having been accused of anything.
Yep. If you're alleging mental health, then you can't put unless that person has committed, you're also alleging that they committed a crime, you can't put them in jail and put them with actual criminals. You need to, because we're talking about taking care of mental health issues and providing treatment and help for people who have mental health problems. That we don't solve that problem by putting people in behind bars. We've got to have some sort of a facility And sadly, we closed a bunch of those in the 80s. I don't know. I mean, do we fund the creation of more, mental health detention centers? Do we, obviously we've got to create these courts and appoint judges and hire therapists. We've got to also have somewhere for these people to be temporarily detained so that we're not just throwing them into jail. Because isn't that that's the problem we're seeing with the homeless problem, right? Because most of the people who are homeless have some sort of a mental health issue, and what we tend to do with them is round them up and arrest them and throw them in jail, and then they get treated in jail. That's not going to help.
California is a perfect example of that. And I think you're right. It was back in the 80s. They closed all of their state-run mental institutions.
Mm-hmm.
If you were quote unquote committed for mental illness, that the state was obligated to take care of you, that you were institutionalized, and in the institution you were provided with mental care, and you were provided with a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and food in your stomach.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the saddest things that we've seen in our society is the state taking care of people that are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves. We see this with the various welfare programs, but they completely bailed on those people who truly are incapable of taking care of themselves. If a person is so mentally ill that they need to be in an institution, at the very least, our society should do what they can to take care of those people rather than simply discard them where they live on the streets. Many of them are they deal with severe abuse on the streets. Women in particular, there's many instances of rape and sexual assault that takes place within the homeless communities. And yet we treat these people as if they are just garbage to be tossed out.
They end up self-medicating with alcohol and drugs.
Yes.
And the ones who can function in society but still have those mental health problems that lead them into violence, we need to have a system in place to deal with those people. So if we're treating these gun violence protection orders or extreme violence protection orders, whatever you want to call them, we're treating these as involuntary commitments to evaluate the mental health of the person who's been reported. So we have to do that. We can't just take their guns away and leave them out in public. We have to take care of them for whatever period of time. I would suggest no more than 72 hours, during which time they're provided with, as you said, 3 squares and a bed, and free from abuse and not in a jail cell, and a hearing, and an evaluation by a mental health therapist to determine, is this person really a danger? If they are, then what do we do next? And that probably involves, now because you've detained them and you have them away from the people that perhaps they were threatening, or you have them away from home where their guns are, you don't have to go in and confiscate their firearms, right? You have the person, you're evaluating that person's mental health and trying to determine whether or not to continue to hold them or to submit them for treatment, or should we at that point seize their firearms after a determination has been made?
Yeah. Yeah, and in some cases, if you have a person who lives by themselves, maybe there needs to be a temporary, and I wouldn't even call it a confiscation or a seizure, but a temporary custody by law enforcement of their firearms if that's deemed necessary.
Yeah, I think that was a bad use of, I shouldn't have said confiscate.
Yeah, I like the term temporary custody, with emphasis on the term temporary.
Temporary.
That, until you are, and maybe that's one of the policies that needs to be set in place, that the police will have a special area where basically these are kept under deposit and they are released free of charge, no cost for any processing to the individual once it has been determined that they are of sound mind and not a threat to anyone.
Yep.
And again, all of this, the biggest issue that I have is that these laws permit it for law-abiding citizens to be treated as criminals when there has been no evidence presented and there's been no criminal charges filed against the individual.
Right. The accusation of a crime makes it easier. Right. Because now you have some concrete proof. I don't want to say proof, but you have a reason to do something with this person. In this case, it would make sense to put them in jail. But if, like you said, we're talking about someone who is communicated through their behavior or through verbal cues or writing or video or audio, a propensity or potential for violence, and they haven't yet committed a crime, which is, it used to be that, I don't know how it works now. My understanding is that it's extremely difficult to get a family member committed who has, even if they have actual mental health problems.
Right. Yeah, the laws have been changed to make it incredibly difficult to have somebody that is, clearly disturbed be involuntarily committed by a family member.
And I think that's part of our problem here, right? Because like we were talking about with the shutdown of all the state mental health institutions in the 80s, because supposedly they were cruel and terrible. Yes, there were abuses, but rather than reform the system, we threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Right.
And I think that's the biggest problem is that they were so worried about the abuses that they made it virtually impossible to have somebody involuntarily committed.
And now we're in a situation where we don't have a system. We have to build a whole new system. So for any of this stuff to work, we have to treat these these gun violence or extreme violence protection orders like involuntary commitments. And to do that, we have to have a system, a national system, or each state has to have I think we probably need a national system, administered at the state level, maybe funded by the national government. I don't know how we do that. We'll figure that's not part of this. We're not going to get any money for coming up with that idea. So we won't go into that. But there has to be some system that allows for the state to care for individuals who are truly mentally ill. And this would solve two problems. This would solve this issue with people who are violently mentally ill and yet somehow seem to function in society. And it would also provide us a system to care for those who ultimately end up on the streets, like we were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, if you are too disturbed to own a firearm, then maybe the state should be taking care of you.
Yes. Yeah, that's the big thing. I have never understood the idea that you go in and you take somebody's guns because they're too dangerous to own them, but you leave that dangerous person still out in society.
Right. Yeah, because what's to stop the person from going and renting a box truck from Budget Rental and driving through a crowd of people?
Or and we've brought up this example numerous times in other sort of contexts. In the context of concealed carry laws, the Carol Bound situation is one, I think, only because it stands out as so egregious and heinous a crime. But here's a woman who had a restraining order, and as we've said many times, and a restraining order is nothing but a piece of paper. If that person is truly dangerous, they'll find a way to commit mayhem, and he did with a knife.
Right. Yeah, if there's a history of violence, that should be automatic approval for somebody to be able to carry a firearm on their person at all times.
And the idea that a restraining order, whether it's one of these red flag laws or any of the existing restraining order laws that exist around the country, the idea that they're going to actually restrain someone who's determined to do someone else harm is incredibly naive. And it doesn't take confiscating somebody's guns. That's not necessarily enough to prevent them, as we saw in the Carol Bound case. That guy didn't need a gun to kill the person who had the restraining order out on him. So you've got to get, if this person is truly dangerous, if they're too dangerous to own to possess a firearm, you've got to detain them for some period of time and determine whether or not they're actually mentally fit. And if they're not, the state has to have a system that will care for them, like you were saying.
Well, and the excuse that's often given is that the prisons are overcrowded. The solution to overcrowded prisons isn't emptying the prisons and letting people like Carol Bone's murderer out loose. The solution should be to build more frickin' prisons.
Yeah. Yep. And the problem that, and I talked about this last week as well, is the idea that our justice system is not certain because we continue to try to make it easy on certain ethnic groups because supposedly they are historically discriminated against. That may be true. Even if it is true, it doesn't mean that you allow a violent criminal, to continue to roam the streets. You're not serving the public in any way by allowing that to continue to happen. And so with these kinds of red flag laws, you have to get those people, if they are truly dangerous, you have to get them off the street. And if they're dangerous because they are mentally unstable, you've got to find a way to treat them and treat them humanely. Now, what happens if they detain someone and decide after 72 hours, this guy's really not, there's really not a threat. There's nothing to this. After a court and a therapist decide that there's no reason to hold you beyond 72 hours, does that person have some sort of redress? Can they sue for redress? Can the court request that person be, I don't know, compensated for lost wages or the court costs or the cost of their own personal attorney and therapist? I think that should be considered as well.
Absolutely. You think of the harm that can be done to an individual. Say your employer, and you find out that, oh, hey, your employee who's been a good employee is suddenly accused of being such a threat to the public that they have to have their firearms seized. And then that person loses their job. There needs to be some sort of accountability that there is financial restitution to the person who is accused if there is any financial loss to them after they've been adjudicated as mentally fit and not a threat. Personally, I think that the burden of that should fall upon whoever has made the accusations in the first place, because that would weed out the possibility of false accusations being made by somebody who just doesn't like the person.
Right. I think there's got to be a way to not only to, just like in any other criminal, in a criminal case where you have a person who's making a false police report, that's a crime. I think there has to be some way to dissuade or discourage people from making false accusations that might get someone detained for mental health reasons.
Right. And if you incorporate all of these elements where, it's restricted to an immediate family member or member of the household or law enforcement that are filing these red flag law, violations, where there is a history of some sort of pattern of either violence or fantasy about doing these horrific acts. If you put all these elements together and make that as the standard, then, these kinds of things would have some sort of level of success preventing violence.
Yep.
And when I say that you'd have to have some sort of financial restitution for someone who is falsely accused, I wouldn't want to end up with the opposite effect, that people would be so afraid of being screwed over financially, of accusing somebody who is truly a threat.
Right.
So where's the happy medium? I mean, that's really where we're stuck with this.
Yeah, you got to find that balance that discourages people from making false accusations, but isn't so cumbersome or burdensome that they're in fear of being accused of making a false accusation.
Yeah, how do you prevent, excessive, unwarranted accusations while at the same time preventing people from being afraid of making legitimate reports? How do you find the balance there? And I think really that's the problem with so much of this, is that it's almost impossible to tailor any laws to maintaining that sort of balance where there isn't unwarranted reporting, while at the same time people are reporting those incidents without fear, and there not being any repercussions upon them if somehow this person is adjudicated perfectly sane when they're really a nutcase.
And I hope that even if we haven't come up with an award-winning program here that will earn us some federal bucks, I do hope this kind of gives people an idea of just how complicated this kind of issue is. It's a complex problem to solve, with trying to create a system to protect us from people who haven't yet committed crimes without violating all the legal and constitutional underpinnings of our judicial system. All right, folks, I think that's going to wrap it up. If you have any comments or any questions about anything you heard here today, if you would like to share your thoughts on what works and what doesn't, your ideas for how to make red flag laws work. I don't think any of us are going to win any federal funding for this, but it was worth a try. Please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail or a voice message. Send us an email. We would love to hear from you. Next week is... What is next week? I think we're going to do... It's time to do another variety show, so we'll have content from the entire cast. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.